CEO mocked a single dad to quit his job on the spot, certain he'd beg. Froze when he started packing. A CEO looked a single father in the eye, in front of 40 people, and dared him to quit. She was certain of one thing. A man raising a daughter alone doesn't gamble. He begs. He stays. He always stays. He didn't beg. He stood up, squared his papers, and said 2 words. And when he walked to his desk and started packing a box, calm, unhurried, like a man who'd been waiting years for permission, it was the CEO who froze. What she didn't know yet was that in 6 hours, her company's biggest product launch would collapse, and the only person alive who could save it would be the man she'd just thrown away. What she really didn't know, what nobody in that room knew, was that the failure wasn't an accident. Someone inside that building had made sure of it. Stay until the end, because the little girl in the story says one sentence in the final scene that made our entire editing team stop working for 10 minutes. Daniel Reyes had a rule. Fix it quietly, then go home to Lily. He was 41, a systems engineer at Halden Robotics, and for 9 years he had been the person other engineers called when a prototype refused to behave. When a control loop drifted, when a sensor lied, when a demo that was supposed to save the company instead threatened to sink it. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't stay late to be seen staying late. He fixed the thing and went home, because home was where Lily was, and Lily was 7, and Lily's mother had been gone for 2 years, and there was no version of Daniel's life where work came before the small girl who still slept with the hallway light on. He kept a notebook, the paper kind, spiral-bound and soft at the corners from being carried in and out of a work bag for the better part of a decade. Inside it were diagrams, tolerance ranges, half-finished sketches of circuits that hadn't been built yet, and a system of shorthand only he could read quickly. Buried on page after page, in the margins, were small notes that weren't strictly technical. A date next to a diagnosis, a reminder to himself about a birthday. Once even a pressed leaf from a walk he'd taken with Lily the weekend after the funeral, tucked flat between 2 pages about actuator torque like it belonged there. It did belong there. That notebook wasn't just how he did his job. It was how he kept score of a life he was still learning to live without a partner in. His supervisor, Renee Chu, sat 2 desks away and had learned half of what she knew by watching him work without asking. She used to joke that Halden Robotics ran on 2 engines and only one of them was on the org chart. Nobody laughed like it was only a joke. Renee had a private theory, one she never said aloud in front of leadership, that half the company's real institutional knowledge lived not in any server or design document but in the quiet, unglamorous discipline of one man who never once put his name on a slide. Vivian Halden, founder, CEO, the woman whose face had been on the cover of 3 business magazines that year alone, had built the company from a single patent and a garage lease, and somewhere in that climb she had decided a founder was only as strong as the fear she could put in a room. She had inherited none of it. Her own father, a mechanical engineer with a stubborn streak and a habit of underestimating his daughter, had told her at 22 that she'd run the company into the ground within 5 years if she ever got the chance. She got the chance at 26, after a boardroom coup nobody outside the company ever heard about, and she had spent every year since proving him wrong in the loudest, most exhausting way she knew how, by never once looking like she needed anyone. A star employee wasn't an asset to her. He was proof the machine didn't need her hand on every lever, and if the machine didn't need her hand, then somewhere underneath all the magazine covers, she was still the 22-year-old her father hadn't believed in. She would never have said that sentence out loud. She barely let herself think it in the dark. But it drove more decisions in that building than anyone, including her, was willing to admit. A quiet single father, in her mind, was the safest kind of person to push, because a man with that much weight on his shoulders doesn't gamble. He endures. She had tested that theory for years in small ways, stripping his name off a fix and presenting it as her own instinct in a board update, thanking a junior hire in front of the room for a save Daniel had actually made, correcting him publicly on things he'd never gotten wrong just to watch whether he'd argue. He never did. Not once in 9 years. Not until the morning of the Aria launch. If you've ever done the hardest work in the room and watched someone else take the bow for it, drop a always below. This next part is for you. Aria was Halden Robotics' flagship product. A home care robotic assistant, 3 years and $40 million in the making. designed to help elderly and disabled people move safely through their own homes. Carrying trays, steadying a person on a staircase, catching a glass before it hit the floor. It was set to demo live for investors and press in 6 hours, in a hall already filling with cameras and money. 2 nights earlier, Daniel had caught what nobody else had. Buried in the newest firmware push was a balance calibration fault that would make Arya misjudge weight distribution the instant it tried to hand something to a person. A flaw that, in the wrong demonstration moment, wouldn't just embarrass the company, could hurt someone. He rebuilt the correction algorithm from scratch that night, tested it twice through the small hours, flagged a secondary tolerance issue in a note attached to the file for whoever picked it up next, and quietly installed the primary fix before sunrise. He said nothing about it to anyone, because by then he had stopped expecting anyone to say it back. Vivian called an all-hands the next morning to celebrate the save. She stood at the front of the room and told the story of the near disaster as if she had caught the fault herself, her hands moving through the air the way they did on stage at conferences, using "we" the way powerful people use it when they mean "I." Daniel let it go. He had let worse go. Then someone from investor relations, young, new, without the floor's ingrained instincts, asked honestly and without malice who had actually found it because she wanted to send a note of thanks before the demo. The room knew the answer. For one long second, the answer hung in the air, waiting to be spoken. Vivian smiled and said these things were never about one person, that nobody at Halden was irreplaceable, and she said it looking directly at Daniel so that everyone in the room understood exactly who the sentence was aimed at, like a blade dressed up as a value statement. Daniel felt something in his chest go very still. Not anger, or not only anger. The quiet arrival of a fact he had spent 9 years refusing to look at directly. That no amount of good work was ever going to be enough, because being seen was never something she intended to allow. He didn't answer. Vivian read the silence as the old submission and pressed her advantage, the way she always had when a room was watching and she wanted a lesson to land in front of witnesses. "Let's be clear about something," she said, loud enough to carry to the back wall. "Loyalty isn't the same as leverage. Some people confuse being useful with being important." She let the distinction settle over the room before continuing. "Daniel does good work. He also knows exactly what a man in his position is worth on the open market, which is why he's never going anywhere. Isn't that right?" He didn't answer that either. The silence stretched long enough that a few people near the front looked down at their hands. Then she pushed a folder a few inches across the table toward him, a gesture of dismissal more than anything, and delivered the line she had clearly been saving, the one that would end up in the video title one day, though neither of them knew that yet. "If you're so good, quit. I dare you." "You won't." She was certain of it. She had run the math on him 100 times in her head over the years. Single father, one income, a mortgage, a school schedule that only worked because the paycheck arrived on time, a life built entirely on the reliability of that number hitting his account every other Friday. Men carrying that kind of weight didn't gamble. They begged. They always, eventually, begged. The room did not breathe. Daniel looked at her for a long moment, and what crossed his face was not what she expected. There was no flush, no scramble, no fear behind his eyes. There was something almost like relief, the expression of a man who has finally been handed permission to stop pretending. He gathered the papers in front of him into a neat stack, squared the edges out of an old habit, and stood. "All right," he said. "Just that. 2 words. Unhurried." Then he walked out of the meeting while it was still silent behind him, and for several seconds nobody in that room understood what had actually happened. Vivian let out a short laugh and told the room to take 5, waving a hand, as if the whole thing had been theater she'd orchestrated on purpose. She believed it, too, believed he'd gone to splash water on his face and would come back with his eyes lowered, and the story would end the way it always ended, with her proven right about human nature. He didn't go to the restroom. He went to his desk, and from a supply closet on the way, he took a flat paper filing box, and he began, item by item, to fill it. He wrapped the small desk lamp Lily had picked out for him at a school fundraiser 2 years earlier. Plastic, shaped like a rocket ship, slightly too bright for serious work, but he'd never once turned it off. He took the framed photo of Lily that lived on the corner of his monitor. The one from her 6th birthday, chocolate frosting on her chin, mid-laugh. He took the coffee mug that had lost its handle and been glued back together twice, because Lily had made it in a pottery class and cried the first time it broke. Renee appeared at the edge of his desk, alarm and something close to admiration crossing her face at the same time. "Daniel," she said, low enough that it wouldn't carry. Don't let her do this. She says things like this to get a reaction. Walk it off. Come back in an hour. She'll pretend it never happened." "I know she will," Daniel said, not stopping. His hands moved with the same calm efficiency he brought to everything, and that calm was somehow more final than any outburst could have been. "That's the problem, Renee. She'll pretend it never happened, and then it'll happen again, and I'll pretend too. And one day I'll look up and realize I taught everyone on this floor that this is how you get treated when you're good at your job." Renee had no answer for that, because it was true, and she had felt the edges of the same truth herself more than once. He lifted the box, tested its weight, set it back down to sign one last document. A resignation letter, 1 page, handwritten, no complaint in it and no explanation. He had drafted a version of it in his head 100 times over the years without ever believing he'd write it. Writing it for real took less than 2 minutes. Word moved through the floor the way bad news always does, quietly and fast. By the time Daniel walked toward the elevators with the box under one arm, most of engineering had drifted out of their seats to watch, and nobody spoke. There was a strange gravity to the sight of him, the most capable person any of them had worked with, carrying 9 years of his life out in a container that had once held printer paper. Vivian came out of her office in time to see him lift the box and walk. She had expected chastened. She had expected a man circling back to his desk within the hour, quietly, the story already rewritten in his head as a bad morning rather than an ending. Instead she got silence, 40 employees standing to watch, and a paper box disappearing into an elevator. For half a second she froze, really froze, the kind of stillness that doesn't perform for a room, because for once there was no room to perform for. Then she caught herself and smoothed it into the expression she wore for the board and the press, the one that never admitted to being surprised by anything. "Well," she said, loud enough for the floor to hear, "I suppose we'll find out how good he really is." A thin smile settled on her lips. "Give it a week. He'll call. They always call." She turned back toward her office as though the matter were closed, as though the number she had run on him 100 times could not possibly have come out wrong. Daniel set the resignation letter on the corner of the reception desk on his way past, because leaving it there felt cleaner than mailing it. He didn't look back at the office. The doors slid open, he stepped inside, and in the polished metal of the elevator wall he caught a blurred reflection of himself holding the box. A man who had just walked away from the safest thing in his life with no plan, no guarantee, and no idea yet whether he'd just been brave or foolish. If you've ever walked away from something safe because your dignity was worth more than the paycheck, comment, "I understand," below. What nobody on that floor knew, not Daniel, not Renee, not even Vivian, was that the fault Daniel had caught 2 nights earlier wasn't a random defect in the firmware. It had been introduced deliberately. Marcus Voss had been at Halden for 11 months, hired laterally from a competitor with a resume built for exactly the kind of visibility Daniel never chased. Marcus wanted the senior systems lead title that everyone quietly understood was Daniel's whenever he decided to take it, and Marcus had grown tired of waiting for Daniel to want something he apparently didn't want at all. 2 weeks before the Aria launch, working late with access he wasn't technically supposed to have unsupervised, Marcus had made a small, deniable change to the balance calibration parameters. Not enough to look like sabotage if anyone ever checked, just enough to make the system look unstable right before launch, on the theory that a crisis discovered after Daniel's known patches were already installed would make it look like Daniel's work, not Marcus's tampering, had caused it. He hadn't accounted for the fact that Daniel checked his own patches twice, out of the same quiet, invisible discipline that had made him worth sabotaging in the first place. Daniel had caught it, fixed the primary fault, flagged the secondary tolerance issue in a note for whoever came next. A note that, 6 hours from now, with Daniel gone and the file locked behind his old credentials, almost nobody would think to look for. Marcus didn't know yet that his sabotage hadn't disappeared with Daniel. It had simply gone quiet, waiting in the system like a fuse nobody had cut all the way through. Daniel spent the early afternoon 3 blocks from Halden's tower, standing in the aisle of a hardware store buying a bookshelf for Lily's room, trying to feel like a man who had just started the rest of his life instead of a man who had just detonated it. Lily sat in a cart nearby, 7 years old, swinging her legs, reading the back of a box of wall anchors like it was a novel because that was simply how she read everything, completely seriously without skimming. "Dad," she said, not looking up, "are we going to be okay?" He crouched down to her level the way he always did for anything that mattered. "We're going to be okay," he said. "It might be tight for a while, but we're going to be okay." She considered this with the gravity only children bring to things adults have stopped taking seriously, and went back to reading about wall anchors, apparently satisfied. His phone rang 9 times before he answered it. It was Renee. "I need the tolerance range for the wrist actuator," she said. "No hello," her voice tight in a way he'd never heard from her. "The one from your note. I can't find your calibration file. It's locked under your old credentials." And the diagnostic panel just went red 20 minutes before the demo starts. There was a pause. Not spite. Just a man deciding 6 hours after being humiliated in front of everyone he worked with what kind of person he wanted to be. "Send me the panel readout," Daniel said. "I'll walk you through it." He stood in the parking lot afterward, phone against his ear, guiding Renee line by line through a fix meant to save a woman who had dared him to fail in front of 40 people that same morning. Lily watched him from the passenger seat with the quiet attentiveness of a kid who had learned to read rooms early, out of necessity, ever since her mother got sick. When he hung up, she asked the question that would matter more than anyone in that boardroom knew yet. "Dad, is that the mean lady's company?" "It is," he said. "Then why are you helping her?" Daniel thought about it the way he thought about everything. Slowly, honestly, without reaching for the easy version. "Because there's people in that building who didn't do anything wrong," he said. "And because being right about what she did to me doesn't mean I get to be wrong about everything else." Lily considered this with the seriousness only children bring to things adults have stopped taking seriously. "That's a very you answer," she said, and went back to her book. He didn't know it yet, but a junior engineer standing near Renee during that call would repeat Lily's exact words. "That's a very you answer," to a reporter 3 weeks later, and it would end up as the pull quote in the headline. If a kid in your life has ever said something that stopped you cold, drop a love emoji. The next part is why the child in this story matters so much. Arya ran flawlessly for the first 14 minutes. It reached for a glass of water at the direction of a planted volunteer in the front rows, adjusted mid-motion the way Daniel's overnight patch instructed it to, and set the glass down without a tremor. The investor room applauded, warm and easy. Vivian, standing at the podium, allowed herself the smallest exhale, the first full breath she'd taken since the meeting that morning. Then, at the 15-minute mark, the diagnostic feed Renee was watching from the control booth spiked. The same tolerance drift Daniel had flagged in his locked note, the one Marcus Voss had quietly seeded 2 weeks earlier and never gotten the chance to finish covering his tracks on. Arya, mid-demonstration, reached for a second glass on a table near the front row, and this time the correction didn't hold. It hesitated, recalculated, overcorrected. For 1 full second, 300 investors and reporters watched a $40 million robot sway like it might fall directly into the crowd. Renee's voice came through Daniel's phone before he'd even finished parking. "It's happening live," she said. "I need the secondary tolerance patch now, and I need you to tell me why your file is locked." Daniel didn't hesitate this time. He talked her through it in real time, line by line, variable by variable, the same overnight fix he'd built for a company that no longer employed him, delivered for free from a parking lot, to save a demo for the woman who had humiliated him 12 hours before Area's own launch. Behind Renee, off camera, a junior technician quietly recorded the whole call on a company laptop, unsure whether it would matter later. It would matter enormously. Arya stabilized 9 seconds before Vivian would have had to walk onto the stage and explain, live, to 300 people with checkbooks, why her flagship product had nearly fallen into the crowd. Set the glass down. The room, which had gone from applause to a held breath, exhaled into applause again. A little too loud, the particular relief clapping of people who just watched something almost go very wrong. Vivian didn't know, standing at that podium smiling for the cameras, that the correction holding her company together in that exact moment had been talked through, calmly, from a hardware store parking lot, by a man she had told 40 people that morning was replaceable. She found out at 6:40 that evening, when Renee finally told her the truth instead of letting her keep celebrating. "It wasn't the team," Renee said, closing the office door behind her. "It was him, again. From outside the building. Because I called and he picked up." Vivian didn't say anything for a long moment. Something was rearranging itself behind her eyes. The private, unglamorous work of a person realizing a belief she'd built a career on might have a hole in it. "Get me his address," she said finally. Before Vivian left the building, Renee did one more thing she hadn't planned on doing that day. She pulled the access logs for the calibration file Daniel had locked. The one that had triggered the near collapse, because something about the timing of the drift had bothered her since the moment Arya first swayed on stage. Daniel's fix had been solid. She'd watched him build it. A fix that solid didn't fail on its own. The logs told a story nobody wanted to read out loud. 2 weeks before launch, at 11:47 p.m., a set of calibration parameters had been altered under credentials belonging to Marcus Voss. A change small enough to survive a casual review, large enough to destabilize the system under live demo load exactly the way it had. Marcus had covered most of his tracks. He hadn't accounted for the fact that Daniel's own file lock, the one everyone had cursed at earlier that day for making the emergency harder to fix, had also preserved a clean timestamp of exactly when and how the original parameters had been changed, and by whom. Renee sat with that information for 11 minutes before she brought it to Vivian because she understood, the way people who've worked somewhere a long time understand things, that the moment she said Marcus's name out loud, there would be no undoing what came next for anybody in that building, including herself. If you've ever caught someone doing something you couldn't unsee, and had to decide whether saying it out loud was worth what came next, you know exactly how Renee felt in this scene. Let us know below. The building had none of the polish of Halden's glass tower. Vivian climbed 2 flights of stairs in heels that had never once been asked to do this kind of work, past a hallway that smelled faintly of someone's dinner 3 doors down, and knocked on a door with a crayon drawing taped just below the peephole. A stick figure family of 2, labeled me and Dad in a child's careful, uneven handwriting. Daniel opened it, still holding a half-unpacked moving box. "I'm not here to offer you your job back," Vivian said, before he could speak, because she'd rehearsed exactly one line on the drive over, and this was it. "I know that's not what today was about. I came because I needed to say something out loud before I lost the nerve for it, and I'd rather say it to your face than let a lawyer soften it into an email first." He waited. Behind him, cardboard boxes lined the narrow entryway. A life half-sorted, half-abandoned mid-decision. "I dared you to leave because I was certain you couldn't," she said. "Because a man carrying what you're carrying doesn't take risks, that's what I believed, and it made you safe to humiliate in front of a room. Today you proved the opposite. You didn't just survive without me." Her voice caught, almost imperceptibly, the first genuine crack in 9 years of a carefully engineered public voice. "You proved I couldn't survive without you. And you still helped anyway. For nothing. That's the part one don't understand yet." Before Daniel could answer, a small voice piped up from somewhere near his hip. He said being right doesn't mean you get to be wrong about everything else. Vivian looked down. Lily stood there, unbothered by the stranger in expensive clothes standing in their doorway after dark, delivering the line the way she delivered most things, like she was reporting the weather. Something in Vivian's face genuinely broke open, not performed, not managed for effect. For a woman who had spent a career reading rooms for weakness in other people, she had just been handed a piece of unguarded honesty from a 7-year-old, and she had absolutely no strategy for it. "Come in," Daniel said finally, opening the door wider, because whatever else was true, a woman standing in a hallway at 8 o'clock at night wasn't someone he was going to leave outside. The apartment kitchen was small, the tea was the inexpensive kind, and the chairs wobbled slightly on a tile floor that had probably been installed decades before either of them was born. Vivian sat without the armor of boardrooms and quarterly reports, in a space built on something other than leverage. She told him, without being asked, about her father. The mechanical engineer who'd told her at 22 she'd run his company into the ground. The boardroom coup at 26 that put her in the chair he never thought she'd earn. The 9 years since spent making absolutely certain nobody, ever again, would look at her and see someone who needed help. I built a whole company on not being able to say the sentence you just watched your daughter say for free, she admitted. Asterisk being right doesn't mean you get to be wrong about everything else. Asterisk I've never once let myself be wrong about anything in front of my own staff. I thought that was strength. Daniel didn't offer her comfort she hadn't earned, but he didn't turn the moment into a lecture either. It's not weakness to be wrong, he said. It's weakness to need everyone around you to think you never are. That's expensive. You've just been the one paying for it with other people's names instead of your own. She sat with that for a long moment, turning her cup a quarter turn on the table the way he did when he was thinking, and neither of them mentioned that she'd picked up the habit from watching him do it twice in the last 10 minutes. Vivian offered him his job back. Then a better title. Then equity, real equity, the kind she had never once offered anyone in 9 years of running the company. Daniel turned the mug on his counter a quarter turn before answering, deciding not whether to say something but how. It was never about the number, he said. I didn't leave because you underpaid me. I left because I was tired of being good at my job in a place where being good at it meant standing there while someone told the room I hadn't done it. You can't put that on a table, Vivian. It's not a salary line. It's a thing you either give people or you don't, and for 9 years you decided not to. She didn't argue. She had come prepared to negotiate and found, somewhere between the hallway and this chair, that there was nothing left to negotiate against. What can I offer? She asked quietly. That isn't a number? Daniel thought about the note nobody had read, the fix nobody had credited, 9 years of invisible maintenance that had kept other people's names on the wins that were actually his. Fix the thing that made me leave, he said. Not for me. I already left. For whoever's sitting in my old chair a year from now. He told her about Marcus, then, not out of spite, but because Renee had called him an hour earlier, torn about whether to say the name out loud to the woman who signed her paycheck, and Daniel had told her the truth deserved to exist whether or not it was convenient. Somebody inside your building tried to make today's crisis look like my mistake, he said. Renee has the logs. That's not mine to fix. That's yours. This is the moment we asked our editors to just sit with. If it hit you too, type respect below. Marcus Voss was let go within the week, not quietly. Vivian made sure of that, in a break from 9 years of handling anything uncomfortable behind closed doors. She brought the access logs to the board herself before anyone could bring them to her, because she had learned, in one conversation in a cramped kitchen, that the version of leadership she'd spent her career building was the reason someone like Marcus had felt safe enough to try what he tried in the first place. A culture that rewards looking good over being honest doesn't just cost you the people who leave. It recruits the people who stay by being willing to cut corners nobody's watching. She stood in front of the same 40 people who'd watched Daniel pack a box that morning and said, without a script this time, that the fault in Aria's demo hadn't been an accident, that it had very nearly been blamed on the wrong person, and that the only reason it hadn't ended in disaster was a man she no longer employed choosing, for no benefit to himself, to pick up the phone anyway. She didn't call it an apology out loud, because the words still didn't come easily to her. But everyone in that room understood exactly what it was. The junior technician who had quietly recorded Renee's parking lot call on a company laptop didn't do anything with it for 3 weeks. She told herself it wasn't hers to share. But when a business reporter covering the Aria launch reached out to Halden employees for background quotes on engineering culture, she thought about the recording sitting untouched on her drive, and about the way the whole floor had gone silent watching a man carry a box to the elevator, and she decided some things stop being private the moment they become evidence of a pattern. She didn't leak the recording. She described it on background in careful, factual language, and let the reporter do the work of confirming it through official channels. The reporter did. Renee, when contacted, didn't deny any of it. She'd already told Vivian the truth once and had no appetite left for telling a smaller version of it to a journalist. The resulting piece wasn't the kind that goes viral for outrage. It was the kind that goes viral because it's quietly, devastatingly specific. A company almost lost $40 million and its flagship product on a stage in front of investors, and the person who saved it live over the phone from a hardware store parking lot had been forced out of the building 12 hours earlier by the same executive team now taking a bow for the recovery. The pull quote the reporter chose for the headline wasn't anything Vivian said. It was Lily's line, repeated back by the junior engineer who'd overheard it on the call. Being right doesn't mean you get to be wrong about everything else. Halden's stock didn't crash. It didn't need to. What happened instead was slower and, in its way, more permanent. Competitors began quietly reaching out to Daniel within days, recruiters who had never once called him in 9 years at Halden suddenly finding his number, because the market had just been shown in exhaustive public detail exactly what he was worth and exactly how badly his last employer had failed to notice. Vivian read the article standing in her own kitchen at 11 at night, alone, the way she read most difficult things now, without an assistant nearby to manage her reaction for her. She didn't call her lawyers. She didn't draft a statement. She sat with it the way Daniel had once turned a mug a quarter turn on a counter while deciding not whether to say something, but how, and for the first time in 9 years, she let a piece of bad press simply be true instead of managing it into something more comfortable. If you've ever watched a company get exactly the reputation it earned, and felt nothing but quiet satisfaction, you're not alone. Tell us in the comments if you've seen this play out where you work. Vivian didn't get the redemption arc handed to her. She had to build it badly at first, one uncomfortable correction at a time, saying names out loud in rooms where it counted, sitting inside the suspicion on her staff's faces without demanding it disappear because she had earned every bit of that doubt over 9 long years. Halden Robotics didn't become a different company overnight. It became a slightly smaller, steadier one that no longer ran on fear, and therefore didn't run quite as hot, which, for the first time in 9 years, Vivian let herself be okay with. She created a formal engineering credit policy, one that made it structurally impossible for a manager to present someone else's fix as their own instinct in a board update ever again. She named it, without asking anyone's permission, the Reyes Protocol, and never once explained the name in a press release, because some things didn't need to be explained to be understood by the people who mattered. Daniel didn't take a job. He took something better. An actual apology that cost her something to say, delivered on his terms, in front of his daughter, with nothing left to gain from saying it. He went back to quietly being the engineer other companies would eventually recognize was worth more than his last paycheck admitted. And 6 months later, when a mid-sized robotics firm across town hired him at a number Halden had never once offered in 9 years, Vivian was the first person to send the note that should have been sent years earlier. You caught it before anyone knew to look. You always did. I'm sorry it took me 9 years and one very honest 7-year-old to say so. Months later, at an industry conference neither of them could gracefully skip, they spoke for the first time since the kitchen. There was no grand reconciliation, no job offer renewed, just two people who had once had power over one another and now, finally, didn't. I owe you something I never said in that meeting, Vivian told him. You were the best I ever had. I spent 9 years making sure you never knew it. That was the mistake. It just took losing you to learn it. Daniel nodded and meant it when he said he hoped the people working for her now got the version of her that had finally understood that. He didn't stay to watch her leave. He had nothing left to prove to her, and more importantly, nothing left to prove to himself. 2 weeks after the conference, Lily had a small part in her school's spring play. A single line, delivered as a tree in a forest scene, which she had rehearsed at the kitchen table every night for a month with the seriousness of someone preparing for Broadway. Daniel had promised her, months earlier, back when he still worked 11-hour days at Halden and missed more of these than he let himself count, that he would be there for this one. No conference calls. No emergencies. Front row. He kept that promise easily now, in a way that had nothing to do with a title or a salary and everything to do with a calendar that finally belonged to him. He sat in a folding metal chair in a gymnasium that smelled like floor wax and construction paper, camera ready, and watched his daughter deliver one line about a tree needing sunlight to grow with the full dramatic weight of a Shakespearean lead. Afterward, in the lobby crowded with proud parents and wilting bouquets from the school's flower sale, Lily spotted a face she recognized and went uncharacteristically quiet. Vivian stood near the back wall, out of place in flats and a plain coat, holding a small bouquet of her own. Not for Lily exactly, she'd explain later, awkwardly, but because she hadn't known the etiquette and it had felt wrong to show up empty-handed. She'd asked Renee weeks earlier when the play was the way a person asks a question they're not entirely sure they have the right to ask. "I wanted to see the tree," Vivian said, which made Lily laugh despite herself, the wary stiffness in her small shoulders easing slightly. Daniel didn't say much. He didn't need to. There was no version of this scene that required an explanation, and the two adults standing in a school gymnasium, 3 months removed from a paper box and a dare that had briefly threatened to define both their lives, understood that some kinds of amends don't get spoken. They just get shown up for quietly at the right folding chair at the right time. Lily was waiting at the kitchen table when he got home that evening, working on a science project about balance and gravity, of all things, a small model with a fulcrum and two mismatched weights she was trying to even out. He sat down beside her, and she looked up without stopping her work. "Dad? Did you fix her company because you're a good engineer, or because you're a good dad?" He thought about it, really thought about it, the way he thought about everything. "Both," he said. "Turns out they're the same rule." Lily nodded like that settled something important, and went back to balancing her weights, quietly, patiently, until both sides finally held even. Daniel's new office had a window that actually got sunlight, and a schedule that ended, most days, in time to pick Lily up from school himself instead of paying someone else to do it. He kept the notebook. He still filled it with diagrams and tolerance ranges, and somewhere in the margins still the small unrelated notes that had nothing to do with engineering and everything to do with the life underneath it. A reminder about a dentist appointment, a doodle Lily had added herself one afternoon while waiting for him to finish a call, a single line he'd written the week after the school play and never crossed out. Turns out they're the same rule. Halden Robotics settled into being a smaller, steadier company than the one Vivian had spent 9 years building on fear. It didn't dominate every headline anymore. It also, for the first time since she'd taken over at 26, didn't lose the people it most needed to keep. She still ran the company like she meant it. She just no longer needed everyone in the room to be a little bit afraid of her to prove that she did. Neither of them would have called it a happy ending, exactly. It was something quieter than that, and in both of their estimations, a good deal more valuable. Two people who had once had power over each other, standing on equal ground for the first time, having learned the hard way, the expensive way, that respect was never a number either of them could have simply written into a contract. If you've ever done the work and watched someone else take the credit, you're not invisible. You're the person everyone else is quietly running on, whether they say so or not. If you've ever been underestimated by someone certain you'd fold, and didn't, we want to hear about it. Tell us in the comments what you packed into your own box, literal or otherwise, the day you finally walked. If stories about quiet dignity, family, and second chances mean something to you, subscribe, because every week we tell another one. And if this little girl earned a piece of your heart tonight, you already know what to type a heart emoji below.